Hey, folks, mere mortals, welcome back. Episode 2. And today we're going to be talking about free will. What does that involve? Does free will exist? Our thoughts on free will? The negatives of talking about free will? The variables to free will? And many more things.
How it affects you as an individual as well, I would say, in your own psychology.
So that's going to be all we're talking about today in free will on our journey to Z. So tune in for that, folks. But before we get started into that, the mere mortal moment. Kyrin, what do you got for me?
You think you have free will, but in reality, all you have is free willy.
Oh, okay, yeah.
My position on free will is that it doesn't particularly exist. So this just captures that, and we'll get onto why I don't particularly believe that.
Good. Yep.
But I was just remembering. I was trying to think of something clever and witty, and I was like, oh yeah, free willy. Oh yeah, everyone has free willy. You got the thought of free will. I think that's probably like one of the movies everyone knows, but very few people have actually seen.
I think I've actually seen Free Willy.
Yeah, all I remember.
I think it was School, The Jump.
Yeah, I remember The Jump. Who doesn't remember The Jump? But do you remember
what type of whale it was?
I have no idea.
Orca whale. I'm pretty sure it's an orca whale.
Okay.
98% sure.
Yeah, but yeah, I don't remember. I had to look up the plot and went, oh, okay. No, I had no idea.
No idea what it was. Cool. I like that. Mine is, we are who we are by the things we do not say.
Okay.
Little powerful one there today. This is probably related to a couple of things, but the majority is just there was a couple of things throughout the week where I said I'd do it and I didn't do it.
Oh.
And we aren't who we are by the things that we say. It is what we do. So a couple of the other ones, like, I'd say, I feel motivated. I feel big day. I'm going to go run 5Ks. Don't run 5Ks. I finished 5Ks, but it's not 5Ks. And see, this is the interesting one for me. It's sometimes I say to people, oh yeah, I went and ran 5K 2 days ago. But in actual fact, the facts of it is I ran 2.4K, walked a K, and then sprinted 500 meters, sort of intervals to reach 5Ks. That isn't a 5K run.
So not in
theoretically,
your
not my mind. Now, in some people it is. So
see, I'd probably count that. It's more about just getting the whole distance done. Doesn't really matter how it gets done.
But I think it was just you got to make sure you're not even lying to yourself. You are who you are by the things you do.
Yep.
Not by what you actually say.
Nice, very good.
Look, free will. Let's define it, and then I want to ask you a question before we really get into it because it's an interesting one that I just thought of mine. For me, the power of acting without the constraint of necessity or fate. Mm-hmm. So it's the ability to act at one's own discretion.
Yep, I'd agree with that. And probably at certain points we might have to go back to that because we might.
Yes, we definitely do.
We might argue over a particular word in that, but what it's trying to get at there, that's really good. So you can read whole philosophical textbooks on the individual word or phrase. What is I? What is action? What is
for me in particular, to get into this conversation, it's. Free will for me is it's you acting without the constraint of you acting to your own discretion. So free will is the ability to you and do something that isn't predicted by something else. It is of your own choosing, of your what you would call yourself, the I. So that's where we're going to begin that conversation. That's how we're going to define it. But I'm going to begin the conversation before we get into it. So I think some listeners might start hear us talking because we might have different views on this and get some examples. But I want to start it is, where has your influence of the idea of free will come from?
Yep. So most of it is Sam Harris.
Okay.
Most of it's Sam Harris. A little bit from my dad as well. And then, the rest is sort of upbringing and stuff. So if I had to put some percentages on it, probably like 85% from the book in particular. What do you call it? Is it called Free Will by Sam Harris?
The Illusion of Free Will?
It could be. I thought it was just called Free Will.
Maybe yep.
That book by him was very influential on me. Some of the things my dad's talked about and just conversations I've had with him is maybe another, let's just say 5%, and then 10% is just the general upbringing I've had. I would say.
Yep. Where I think my idea of free will has probably come 80% from like my experience and 20% of what I've read, obviously research for today, heard from Sam Harris over a lot of podcasts and a couple of other points.
He talks a lot about it, so he's good to
listen to in particular to that.
Yeah.
So one of the things I want to just talk about
it is called free will. But
it is called free will. There you go.
Yeah.
So I want to give you a bit of a point that Sam Harris pointed out. And I think that's a good little stepping in, right?
Yeah.
So he talks about if the scientific community were to declare free will an illusion, it essentially would precipitate a culture war more belligerent than the one that has been waged on the subject of evolution. So essentially, without free will, sinners and criminals would be nothing more than poorly calibrated clockwork, and any conception of justice that emphasized punishing them rather than deterring, rehabilitating, or merely containing them would appear utterly incongruous. So there's just a view of, if free will is an illusion, then we are in for some shit, because we have set up some systems in play to the effect that you have control of your own will.
Yeah.
So that's a little backstory of, when I read that a little bit, that's where I'm starting to get, concerned that free will doesn't exist. What gives you the idea that free will doesn't exist?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to preface this with saying I still haven't done enough research and reading on it. It's a topic I've stumbled across. I've gotten some stuff from it, but it's not one I really dive deep into.
We will this is going to be our dive deep into it.
Yeah. So I'm taking a little bit of classic Juan. I have a strong opinion, but it's sort of held loosely at the moment. So I could be convinced out of this. I'm not dying by this. Why I don't believe we have free will. So I'll just list a couple of the reasons here, and you can sort of attack it from a couple of different angles. So influences and cognitive restrictions, I would say. So particularly reading the book Thinking Fast and Slow, I think it's just over there. I won't bother grabbing it. But that book by Daniel Kahneman, I'd known a lot of this stuff beforehand, but having it all condensed into one place really helped as well, which is seeing just how little control we have when we think we have control. And that book's really good because it gives a lot of just very easy examples where he says, using probabilities, or he primes you in some way and then asks you a question. And like we were saying with the sort of red hammer thing, there is every tool imaginable, every color imaginable, but 50% of people would say red hammer if you ask them to name a color and a tool. So that has sort of convinced me, like, okay, that's like one little like axe in the tree stump of free will for me. It's like a big chunk getting shot out at the bottom, which is that whatever you think free will is, from the most ideal perspective, which is every action that I take, I have full command over, and I know exactly what I'm doing. I think you can chuck out 99.9% of those straight away just by looking at the brain and realizing, like, okay, you're influenced by so many different things that you don't think influence you, but actually do, that sort of just takes away the free will you have in those choices. So
my first question, just to kind of dive in here, is, do you define that as that's free will of your conscious self, or free will also of your unconscious self?
Okay, so
because and so I'll give you maybe some time. So what I mean by that is, with the idea of priming in a red hammer, I agree completely that is beyond your conscious will. The ability to prime someone, that skips a conscious self. That's going into somewhere else in your brain. But you still have, to me, something in your subconscious then deriving that to then be presented to what your response is. But where does your line of free will end at that point? Because to me, free will then, to me, in the subconscious, is still the definition that is still within my control. And it's in my control because it is something that I've preloaded my sense and understanding through evolution, through nature, through nurturing, to the point that is in control of my mind. Like, if you didn't know what the color red or the color or hammer was, you couldn't answer that question in that way. So it's not like a deity coming from above telling you this is the answer. It has to be within your nature. But I'm keen to hear, where does that line of free will for you sit?
Okay, I would not say that anything that happens in the subconscious that you act upon, you can then somehow trace that back to having free will. I would say no, because
I'm interested in those. Right.
I think if you just took random samples of you did something unconsciously, the last 5 breaths, for example, you didn't have them, and I would say you didn't have the experience of acting upon those. There was no I there which was dictating, I'm going to take these next 5 breaths. They just happened.
Yep.
So I would argue that same sort of reasoning applies to those other more edge cases where it does feel like you're actually doing something, but in reality, I'd say nah. If you look a little bit deeper in the subconscious, that you would look at that and then say, oh, okay, no. You'd look at the stats and say, yeah, I sort of knew you were going to do this. Another good example, we've talked about this before, is they hook you up to an MRI and you've got a button to press, or you can say when you're going to choose which button or whatever it is.
Yep.
And they're able to sort of predict, they can see in your brain the chemical decisions or the electric decisions that you've made a choice before the subjective feeling of you saying, yes, I've made my decision.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just summarize that particular point. You're saying free will is to you essentially, and when we're talking that definition, it's to act at one's own discretion. That is based on the conscious self.
Yep.
Not the subconscious. And see, this is interesting because I've always thought of the free will conversation as everything.
Okay.
As in, if someone says free will doesn't exist, it's both conscious and subconscious. It's almost like conversation of, doesn't even matter what you decide to do because it's been driven by a path. It's not even your choice at all. You know what I mean? So it's interesting to note that you're thinking about it from that line in the sand, or at least from that conversation.
That part of it, but I would also then say the conscious experience, whatever you think that is, that you have free will there. In reality, I would say no. I would say no.
Yep. Okay. So so that bit is, let's just say I'm going to tell myself right now, I'm going to pick up this globe and pick it up like this.
Yeah.
Even though I was thinking about that consciously, you're saying no, there wasn't a free will. That was driven mainly by your subconscious, already deciding that you're already going to be moving it.
I would say that's getting to the point of getting that. I guess I've one thing I just attacked there was the subconscious part.
Yep.
So then, all right, now I'll talk about the conscious part, which is what Sam Harris talks about as well, which is sort of what convinced me of this, was you talk about, okay, what is the I? What is this conscious feeling that we have? And just through some of the experiences I've had with meditation, which is when you dig really deep into your own self and looking, okay, what is it to be Kyrin? What is this I person in here, this feeling?
Yep.
Some of the experiences you can have when you go really deep in is sort of it's struggling to point where it originates from. So the vision, for example, is a big one. I feel like I'm looking out, but when I really look at it and sort of take a step inwards and look, it's sort of almost like, if I go real in deep enough, it sort of feels like I'm actually looking on a screen in essence. Okay. So, where's the eye and the vision? I'm not sure. It's sort of a little bit deeper in. And it feels like if just some of the experiences I've had have swayed me to the point where I say, whatever it is that it feels like, this conscious experience, of being a individual, a person, it is getting really hard to explain, but I just don't think that me picking up this globe and me making that decision, I'm really struggling to say, okay, but where's the me? Which part of it is actually me?
Gotcha.
And putting a definite point on saying, yeah, that part was it.
Okay. It might help.
I might explain this a little bit better when we get into some of the hypotheticals, which I've got a big list of.
Hypothetical. Okay, cool. I might just set up my definition and my thoughts on it as well, because that'll help us. So I think now that we're talking about it like that, I've got a few different views. So I think free will exists somewhat, and this is where I'm going to say boundaries. So I've got this view that there's this thing, and this comes from Stephen Pressfield's The War of Art, but it actually comes from somewhere else. I can't remember specifically where, but he was talking about the ego and the self, and this is more about the resistance in doing work. But it all makes me think that within the ego and the self, which the ego is almost that at front of mind consciousness trying to make you do things and remain the same, when the self is a little bit of your subconscious, a little bit of your consciousness, and that you know what's right, or your inner being, your inner habits knowing what to do and everything like that. I think free will exists in that realm to me, in the way or in the sense that I can drive for myself a specific need that to say, yep, I'm going to go and do this, and I'm consciously making that decision. And to me, that feels, and this is more from experience, it feels like I've got free will. So in the fact that I say at 10 a.m. I'm going to stand up and I'm going to go and do something, whether that comes from the conscious or the subconscious mind, if I've memorized it and put it into my hippocampus so it can be recalled as long-term memory, that's me doing a free willed act. But then I get to the point of, do I have free will control of my hippocampus and those particular things? That I'm going to unfortunately have to say it's murky. And the reason I say it's murky is I'm starting to read a couple of things where 20 years ago, people thought it was impossible to, say, affect your gamma waves of your brain. So there's a lot of things with meditations and the higher levels, especially in the scientific community. I don't know if you've read into alpha waves and beta waves. A little bit, yeah. Right? So you can kind of control your alpha waves, your beta waves, your theta waves. You can control that. But one of the really, really powerful ones is your gamma waves, because your gamma waves control how much, I think, serotonin is produced and your restfulness, all these sort of things. And for many years, people were like, no, you can't do that. You cannot. But people started to do it now, very, very recently, not directly, but indirectly through causation of changing some of the alpha beta waves directly. And in 20 minutes, raise the gamma waves. Now that's starting to get a little bit murky to me, because I'm thinking, okay, well, that would have been something I would have thought you had no control over, absolutely at all. But now there's some scientific proof and experiences that you can control that. Now, if you're directly controlling and changing some of those chemical reactions in your brain, that starts to make me think, okay, everything you experience to me comes from your brain. Like, I'm just looking at it scientifically, comes from your brain. All your experiences, if you didn't have a brain, you ain't experiencing any of this. Yep. Flat out, right? So for me, I was starting to think, okay, well, if we're starting to learn how to control some of those aspects of our brain, what's not to say that there's some level that we just don't know about yet to control a lot more of it? And does that then entail the fact that you're controlling the will of anything that you do? So that's where it gets murky. And I'm not saying I believe that. I'm just saying there's pieces that I'm starting to see that you could do that, and that's where it's falling a bit murky for me.
Yeah, okay.
If I had to say, like, gun to my head, current thoughts, I'd say a lot of consciousness. I'd say you have some will of it. Well, no, in your consciousness, you got a lot of will. Yep. Like, you can consciously do a lot of things, and I would call that there's free will there. In terms of you can decide to do that. But once you get into the subconscious levels, you're starting to lose free will in terms of what you can really do and not do. So I look at it almost, and I wrote it down, to me, is there variables to free will? And to me, I thought, yes, there is. To me, the answer of free will isn't yes or no. Yeah, it depends on some of the context. Yeah. And that's where you can, I've seen a lot of fights on this with people. It's like, it's a yes or a no. I'm just going to hold it to myself and say, there's some that I'm definitely agree with people. I don't see free will in that. Well, there's others that I'd say, yes, I agree with free will. Yeah. So one example I wanted to give you was, and this might come into hypotheticals. But before we get into hypotheticals, I don't know if this is already a hypothetical to you, but if we're kind of, and your point of view with the free will, you think, okay, no, it might not prevail as a free will. What do you say about people getting charged for the fact that they committed a murder? So So he was just an interesting one. Right? So criminal law recognizes instances of diminished responsibility. So this is the husband who beats his wife's lover to death in a blind rage when he catches them in, flagrante delicto is considered less guilty than if he had sought revenge weeks later in cold, premeditated manner. So, if you kill someone weeks later, just you're planning it, you were going to do it and you killed them, or if you killed them in the passion action that you saw someone do something terrible and you killed them, that's seen in criminal law different. There's diminished responsibility. Yeah, for sure. However, if there's no real sense of free will, if what just happened was going to happen, then my view is that would just fall apart. All of a sudden, you just have to give humans like a particular sentence, because no matter if it was premeditated or not, there was no free will in place. Now, do you see it that extreme? Do you think?
Well, so one argument to that is, okay, just because there is that sort of act of doing what is just and sort of like vengeance on a person in essence, which when you get to it is pretty harmful in a lot of ways. Actually wanting revenge, actually feeling this person did bad, so they deserve bad done to them. That sort of feeling, and well, they deserve it because they made the choice to do bad.
Yep.
Now, say they didn't have that choice and they did bad and there was no choice involved. I don't think that necessarily precludes, and Sam Harris talks about this, is that doesn't mean that you can't, that there can't be actions and systems in place that deter what we all agree is not good. So killing someone, for example, yes, I think we've all pretty much agreed that's a bad thing. Let's not get too deep into their ethics and whatnot.
Yep.
So we all agree killing is bad. Now, how do we stop someone from doing that? Well, one, we can't let a killer just go around doing whatever they want. That's not. Also, another thing we all agree is that we all have some sort of autonomy, and we, deserve in certain cases to try and lead the best life possible. And you can't do that if you're getting killed out of nowhere.
Yep. So
acting punishments on people, even though it might not be, I could definitely see a system being placed where it's like, we're empathetic. You didn't have a choice in this, but to stop you, to deter you from doing this to other people, if you're psychopathic and this is just going to happen all the time, if there's a chance for redemption, if you spend time in penitentiary, do a punishment, which would then affect your actions, whether there is actually a free will associated with that or not. Yep. And you could sort of see this almost as, let's just say, like dog training, for example, and view humans as dogs. Let's just say dogs don't have free will, but you can still train dogs to do certain things and not do certain things. Yep. So that's how I would sort of put that.
Okay. One point that you touched on there, because this is where I thought, where are we going to get an interesting discussion more than just the humans? And this is where I'm going to step a little bit into deeper philosophy. So, and stop me if there's another point you want to talk about. Free will. We talk about free will ultimately as humans, right? And I think that's where people not get stuck, but get defined by. And then I sort of immediately think, and gee, this is coming up more and more in my mind now, but boundaries, right? Everything is bounded by the conversation that you decided to be. Something means something completely different if you change it to another different realm, right? So, we can be talking about free will, and imagine if we actually did know that there's like a seventh dimension, that there's clowns looking after us and doing everything we do. Whatever we're talking about doesn't actually matter, and I've just revealed our overlords. Yeah. But one thing that I talk about, you talked about dogs, right? Is, would you say dogs have free will?
Probably not.
Right. And so then do you define that as the fact that dogs don't have free will because just like we do? So you're saying, no, we don't have free will either. Do they have a level of less free will, or do you think it's just the exact same no free will?
Yeah, I'd say it's the exact same level of no free will, but it's just more obvious that they don't.
Gotcha.
In dogs.
Okay. Yeah. So the way that I see it is, free will is, I'm going to call it out, is a ratio of conscious to subconscious, I guess, understanding or permeation within a self, within an object, within matter. Yeah. So the more level of consciousness you have, and this is obviously, there's definitions of consciousness, but if you can be, the more conscious you are relative to your subconscious, I'm going to say there's more free will in that entity than the opposite. So then I would agree that a dog would have a more view of less free will that it's displayed, and I believe it to be because there's less consciousness there than there is subconscious. So I do think there's some subconscious minds going through, and that's derived by brain matter and whatever it may be. Yeah. But let's take it another step further. So then there's a discussion of, okay, what about like trees? Yeah. Do trees have free will?
No.
Right. And then I'd get to the point of saying no. And at that point, I'm saying, so in my example, I think it's because there's no conscious thought there. I think if there's any thought, and this goes into the definition again of consciousness, because they don't have a brain, I would just say, if there's any consciousness, it's all subconscious, and there's no conscious sort of rational mind going on in there. It's just something, and whether that's energy or anything else, Who cares? You want to call it whatever it may be. I just see it that way in the realm, in the level of free will.
Yeah.
So, sort of my take on that.
Yeah.
Now,
Nice.
do you have a couple of hypotheses, or is there any a couple of other points you want to touch on?
Yeah. So, I guess you already talked about this, so let's dig into it a little bit. What percent do we have? So we've already talked about animals. You already talked about, I guess, the difference between the conscious bit and the unconscious. So you would, I guess, agree that if humans could have 100% free will, well, we've already got a third of it taken away because we sleep, and so nothing's getting done there. We're not measuring. We have no consciousness essentially in there. A little bit in the lucid dreaming if you get into that, but for the most part, no. What about babies? When do babies have free will in your eyes?
I think they have free will, but to much lesser extent than full-grown adults might.
Yep.
And I would attribute that to, again, whatever you want to call it, that a baby has less consciousness than they do subconsciousness.
Yeah.
So there's, who knows? Gee, it'd be interesting to see this, but I reckon, young babies, there's a lot of development coming through nature and nurture into the subconscious, and they're building those, and their brain's just pretty much still molding away. So it's building all those channels and nodes and connections to build the subconscious and all the stream of thought that comes through there. And there's not too much consciousness happening at that point. Everything, the baby's almost acting purely on impulse.
Yeah.
Like that animalistic sort of baby.
Okay. A guy in a comatose state where the sort of, I guess, like link between his brain and his body has been severed.
Yep.
And so, the body is still functioning, but there's no ability to actually move anything. And let's just say not even the eyeballs. They're just in there. Their brain's showing all the signs that a normal human brain would show of thinking certain things, or, the hippocampus getting inflamed by something or whatever. Does that person have free will trapped inside of that body?
I'd say yes. I'd say still yes. And so this gets, let me maybe define free will a bit, because I'd like to get your answer.
Yeah.
So mine, when I looked at the definition of free will, is the ability to act at one's own discretion.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people will get stuck in the realm of, well, that means like I can't move my eyes, or I can't breathe in a particular way. And I think that person to me still has some free will. And my thought behind that is because I think that individual could still dream, or he could still forcibly play something in his mind that isn't him actively moving in the world, but it's still in some way or shape or form, he is forcing some chemical reactions to happen in his brain. So the fact that his hippocampus gets inflamed, there's portions that are not free-willed in terms of whatever, just there's a smell and you just react to something, or you can actively be thinking, okay, well, let's think about 20 years ago, and then you inflame your hippocampus because you're consciously thinking about something. So it's derived by you wanting to go and think about something. So I'd say there is some free will there. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm diving into, let's just say, your point of view now.
Yep.
And I would say no, just because the action sort of seems to be if you go back to your definition, the
power of acting.
Yeah, the power of acting. And I would say that there's no acting in that person. There's they're trapped inside of a place where there's no actions being performed by them, even though there's consciousness in there. I wouldn't say there's free will, because they can't do anything with that consciousness. So I would also say that if you figured out right now, or that you were actually right now a body somewhere matrix style, plugged in, and you're just living this matrix world here, I would also say no, you're not. You don't have free will, because your actual body is elsewhere, and you're just in a box in here in this world.
So I'll bring it to an example as well. That is, you could totally do. And I want to get your answer to this. So you strap yourself into a chair, you're completely immobile, you put the virtual reality headset on, you go into this world where you're completely not moving, and all your actions are being derived by you just thinking things. So it's taking just pure thoughts into where you're moving.
Yeah.
Now you come up to a place where you have to go down 7 paths, and one path gives you a sword, one path gives you a shield, the other one gives you some poo, whatever, random shit. And then you go, oh, okay, I'm going to go down path 4. Now,
poo path.
You don't, to me, that is, you have some free will there of consciously deciding to go down the path 4, but you have not moved your body at all. This is pure mind. You have decided this action. So to me, because of that description, I would still say, yes, there's still some action there from a brain capacity, and you've gone and done something. Something has happened. And to me, I would define that as the power of acting without fate or necessity, or it is at one's own discretion. You've decided from a brain perspective, I want to do 4. Then some subconscious shit happens, whatever may be happening in the brain that you don't have control of, but you've had a decision. You've had some at play decision to make that choice. Yeah. So I believe there's free will there, even if there is no movement in the body.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can see that. That's pretty convincing as well.
So like I'll even step it back then, away then from the virtual reality conversation. If you do something as a human, or like any animal, any entity, if it has a brain, so this is this example of brain, and you have a brain, if you act and then relative to that, something happens in your brain, and then again, subconsciously connections can happen, I don't give a shit. But if you do that, to me, that's the act of free will, because for all intents and purposes here, your mind creates your entire reality. Without your brain, you don't have reality.
Yeah.
So, and here's, that's probably a little meander down the path, but I think sometimes when people talk about, oh, well, there's the higher realms, and then there's this, and then these experiences, and you'll experience it. My sort of immediate reaction to that, I always think, is that's fine, but unless your brain has the capability to understand and perceive that, then you don't have a brain to go into those like spaces, and how are you actually even going to contemplate or understand what's happening? Like if you don't have that aspect, which I'm just saying, a brain gives you consciousness and you have the ability to be conscious in some way and to think rationally, understand what's happening, then I find it very hard to understand how you're going to go down to different planes and understand it without that. Like what is then creating that connection in your mind?
Yeah. Actually, sort of being realistic in a sense, which is not making claims that are unverifiable.
Yeah. I mean, but my take on the illusion of free will, and this is where I agree, or this is how I tend to agree to Sam Harris, because I also, if then with describing this, I agree that free will is an illusion for then a lot of things, like things that you do day to day that's coming from your subconscious, the ability, I think there was that study where, again, people pressing buttons and the like, and your brain is already, creating those electronic movement patterns already before you've said the word. So I think where people get all stuck up about this is, I think, no, I'm controlling everything. No, like it's your brain and other subconscious layers of you doing it. Like it's not really you doing a lot of things. Breathing, you're not doing that. That's your subconscious doing that. And people get really in a knot when you say to them, well, free will doesn't exist. And they're like, no, but I can control. That's where I'm like, I'm not saying that that's not the case. You can bump things. You can do things. You have a conscious brain that has control of your free will in that portion. And then you have a hell of a lot portion of your brain and being that isn't free willed at all. Like there's just nothing you can do about that.
Yeah. I'll just give a little backstory here. So when I was reading his book, I really, really struggled with it, and I found it very, very distasteful. Reading the book and sort of, he was making, like, the arguments made sense to me, but I also found it really distasteful. And so I noticed myself trying to find ways of poking holes in it in a very emotional way of trying to poke holes in it to make this not real, because it did have that sense of, well, what's the point then? If there's no free will, what's the point of doing any of this? And I think that is a very good point to make, which is, even though I say I don't think there's particularly free will, I act a lot of the time like there is, in the essence of like if you're really pressing me down to it and asking, like, what's at the deepest base reality, what do I think? No. But if you look at me, how I act in the way I speak, the way I interact with other people, I think that's probably the best way of getting the most good done, is by me sort of acting in that way, in essence. And it's not a conscious thing all the time. I'm doing it. I'm acting like I have free will most of the time. And it's just on this particular, it's almost like a theological point. So getting real, discussing down into the deep diving into the one particular topic. It can be ethics, it can be justice, it can be whatever.
Yep.
And you can come to some sort of, I would say, like rational or argumentative conclusions, but then applying that into the real world and you being able to use it in the real world is a very different thing. So
yes. Here's a point though for free will where then it starts to get a little bit extreme, almost to the point. So there's like you're talking about getting to the foundation. It's a no. How much have you thought about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle when it comes to free will?
Yeah. So that essentially is saying, nothing can really be.
It's essentially you can't.
It's in a state of flux until someone observes it, right? Is that the?
Well, it's a little bit. So it's essentially a definition of when we're talking about particle, but think about it in wave, think about it whatever it may be. That you can get closer and closer and closer to it, but you can only pinpoint the velocity or the movement or the location, but you can't have both.
Yeah.
You can have one or the other. You can tell with absolute precision the velocity of something, but you can never tell where it is, or you can say exactly where something is, but you can never tell what the velocity of that particle is or the acceleration of it. So that's Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And that a lot of that is carried through to quantum mechanics and the way that it works at the very small.
Yeah, and that's sort of an argument against determinism, which is saying
correct.
If you had a computer or whatever it is, if somehow it was possible to have knowledge of every single atom in the universe and how it's behaving,
then you know exactly what's going to happen.
Exactly what's going to happen.
Yep. And then when it comes to that, is an interesting one because Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and quantum mechanics isn't what we experience in life. And here's a little bit, it's going to be people find it really hard to grasp with quantum mechanics or string theory or a lot of these things because it isn't what we experience. So when we talk a lot about free will and no free will and the variables to it, a lot of people can clock up and go, well, no, that's not what I experienced. And it isn't. No, it isn't. But sometimes the way that the universe works and the way that humans works and the way that chemistry works, you don't experience that. Like you don't experience your neurons firing. You don't experience like some headache because your neurons are firing all these things. You don't. It just happens.
You don't experience the heat particles, sort of breaking off the atoms in your hand and going out into the
You don't feel your skin when it disintegrates and it just peeling off and falling off.
Carbon into another sort of material.
So
you just feel the pain of that going in.
So here's this one. So I mean, describe it, people. Uncertainty principle, it's called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Came out in 1927 by a German physicist. His name was Werner Heisenberg, if you're curious. And again, that the position and the velocity of an object cannot be both measured exactly at the same time, even in theory. Now, this goes into the valley of, okay, let's think about it really deep down. And so when I saw that and saw the conversations around it, there's an explanation if it doesn't make sense, and I might share it, but this is the way I kind of explain it. Imagine if you dial down all the way down to a neuron. So you're thinking this is the pathways in your brain. You've got neurons flying about. Now, if you look at a particular neuron, if I'm looking at free will and consciousness, if you start getting into those realms, I then see free will just completely breaking down because under this principle, you can't really articulate either where it is exactly or the velocity of its movement of where it's moving around.
Yeah.
So at that point I go, well, if you can't tell that realistically at those positions and that's happening, then to me, free will doesn't even exist because you could think something, but these particles are just going all over the place. Like sure, the probability of it happening is very, very high. Like the probability of my finger going through this thing is 0.000, like so many zeros that it's so improbable to happen. But the probability exists there. So it's just a whole world of probability and statistics. Similarly with free will, the probability of something you say like, I'm going to touch this thing is extremely high because in probability's sake, it's going to happen. However, there is another probable side of the statistics realm of the uncertainty principle that if you delve down deep to it, it might change. And if there's a possibility to that change, you don't control that change. And then by definition to me, there is just no free will at all.
Yeah.
But that's when you look at boundaries. So that's why I'm thinking if someone had to then point blank talk to me about the boundary of looking at it like that, I'd go, okay, well, there's no free will.
Yeah.
But as you start exploring it out and then what you feel and the self comes into play and all this, then it starts changing a little bit. So I don't know. I thought I'd bring that up because I did always find that interesting when physics and scientific principles start coming into play. It starts changing the whole conversation until you introduce the injection of, well, what about that experience of a human? and then you start getting into, okay, well then you've added another layer and whatever else.
Yeah. I'm not going to lie. I got lost a little bit in like the middle portion of what you were saying there, but it was like, I think I still sort of understood what you were saying, which was,
Okay,
if you break it down to a certain point, to the point where there's sort of like obviously no consciousness, or at least consciousness in the way that we use the word, then free will can't really exist there as well.
Is basically I'll read this example, because if it might have gone through a bit, maybe the listeners have as well. So this is going to be maybe a minute. So listen in.
Good.
So if the uncertainty principle sounds complicated, let me give you an example. Imagine a bomb connected to a detector that registers radiation. When the detector detects the radiation, the bomb is triggered. Furthermore, the detector is encased in a thick lead casing so that ambient radiation can't enter, right? Can't enter. So that we then place a small amount of low-level radioactive material inside the casing. When an atom in the material decays, it sends out radiation, which the detector registers, and then the bomb explodes, right? So the catch is, there is no way to figure out when the bomb will explode. That's because if you have a very small amount of the radioactive substance, like let's say 10, 100 atoms, and it has a long half-life, it can take anywhere from a fraction of a second to hours, days, or years, right? Because a half-life of a decaying atom can be just literally anything. It can be so long. So all we can do is to figure out the probability of when it occurs. But in reality, no one knows exactly when.
Yeah.
So this is a conversation of, this is just pure decay of atoms. To know when a bomb explodes, you can use probability to detect when something is going to happen, but you can never be certain of exactly when it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so that's my principle thinking about neurons and conversations is, yes, you can say, I want to say the letter O, and the probability of that is extremely high. But in reality, when you get really deep down into like seeing that exact particular neuron, you can't ever really predict what the path and the speed of that is. And the probability is extremely high, but there is a probability that it isn't. And because of that, you can't say for absolute truth it is. And so to that end, there can't be free will because you cannot lock it down ever as a correct thing. So, and that's the big debate. But so obviously determinism and sort of this principle, that's kind of like the opposite view. But this is what a lot of people, when they talk about there's no free will, that's what they kind of lay themselves on. It's like, well, this happens. But it defies experience.
But that's the other problem. It's like, okay, randomness happens. Okay, so something random happens. That means you can't determine the universe. Therefore, you can't say, that you don't have a choice in the action that's being made because randomness comes in. But then it's like, okay, well, randomness isn't free will either. That's not me making a choice. That's a random action occurring. So I wanted to go more on the I side of your description, the ability to act at one's own. So one's own. That particular. So for you, where does it feel like you're making decisions from? Like where is Juan? Where is the agent that is?
Okay, so I'm going to explain it by Stephen Pressfield's one because I really, really enjoyed that. And it's there's the ego and the self, and I'm pulling apart what the context of that is because he used it for creativity in that. But I really enjoyed that as like an explanation of just as like what you understand as human and consciousness. So I understand one's own as there's the portion of what I'll call the ego, and that is your animalistic brain, your amygdala that responds to things, and then in turn you respond consciously in free will because you yourself, like that thought process is going through part of your brain and you were deciding to go and do X, Y, Z. So even so in my mind, if you go for like an animal comes up and you start running, there's portions of subconscious, but there's a portion of consciousness through that and free will because you can at any point decide I'm going to stop and get eaten. You can decide that completely, but you don't. You choose, yes, I'm going to keep going based on what my mind's telling me. So one's own, I still see that bit as what I call like the ego still is own, what then goes into the self. And so the better description I think is one's own, I'll say it's the self, and the self is defined as anything that you can consciously do.
Yeah.
So anything that you can, and the definition of that's going to be weird, but anything that you can actually consciously do is what I define as one's own. So if you can act in the conscious space, I'd say yes. That's my definition of what then encapsulates the ability of free will.
Yeah. So can you have free will when there's sort of, I guess, like two of those selves? Because I think we've all had those situations where you'll notice yourself like self-sabotaging, where it's, oh, why did I do that? Or you'll have an argument in your own brain of like, I know I need to do this, but another part of your brain is saying, no, like Juan, no, I'm not going to do that. Or it's almost like, two Kyrins are in there battling against each other.
Yep.
And does that affect your thoughts on free will if there's almost like two of you in there?
See, that's an interesting one, but I just think that's almost... no, I don't. And I think that's almost a contrived view that humans put on a conversation that in the mind is still within the one self. That's almost like you have actively created multiple parties within the one self, or almost multiple egos within the self to have this conversation, but it's still in a conscious way. And I guess, so when people say like, oh, why did I self-sabotage and do this or do that? When you have that conversation with your mind, I think maybe the more correct assessment in my mind would be, okay, something was done subconsciously or was done incorrectly by something that I just had no free will about, and might have been because I learned it that way, or you've naturally just learned to do it a particular way. Let's imagine that you've lived for 20 years all your life and like everything that ever been taught to you is you have to run from every single spot you have to ever do. And then you go to a random, like say you come to Australia, you go to Sydney, you're in a city, and someone tells you like, oh, can you walk from here to there? And all you know is run, and you have to run. And so you run, and someone then tells you afterwards like, oh, this is what walking is. You should do this. And at that point, if you say, oh, well, I've self-sabotaged myself, I would say, well, no, that was more subconscious. You didn't even have the free will to do that. You've never even understood what that is consciously. But you're having this conversation now in the conscious, in a free will, to go and act with free will.
Okay.
So maybe that's how I'll try to describe it.
That one.
Yeah.
I didn't get that one.
Okay.
Before, when I was asking you, where is the one, I actually wanted a real easy answer for you, which was the brain. So you would
Oh,
say
right.
the brain.
Okay.
So the physical one. But we went down an interesting path, so that's good. What would your experience be like, and do you think it would affect how you think about free will if your brain and your heart were switched? So your heart's actually up in here and your brain's actually in here. Because one of the reasons we think that we're like physically located, whereas Kyrin,
like here,
it's here. Everything you experience is from here. It's not Kyrin's out here.
Yep.
It's not Kyrin's in my leg. You can cut off my leg and I'm still going to say, okay, no, the free will part of me that didn't reside in my leg. But obviously with the brain, it's here. And that's because most of the major senses are here, the eyes, the taste, the smell, the ears. So if the brain was actually sitting around where your heart is and your heart was up in here, I would still say you would feel like you're up in here in this area, even if you were down in, actually the brain was actually down in your chest. So what would that do to your perception of the self and like what is you? Whereas as far as like pointing, whereas say that instantly switch for everyone in the world right now. Yep. I would still say basically everyone would say
nothing's changed.
Yeah, nothing's really changed. I'm up in here.
I agree. I agree. But my reasoning behind that is because your key senses, I think it's more your senses that derive what the feeling of that self is. And as you said, you've got your eyes, ears, mouth. The only different ones are kind of your touch and your sense of smell. But because a lot of it is still up here, you would still feel like, well, I'm still looking from my head, not looking from my brain. And I'm hearing from up here, not hearing from down here. So even if it swapped, I wouldn't say that it would change anything, to be honest.
Because I'd still say like, okay, that might be a little bit of a aha moment, which is, okay, well, you think you're here, but we know you're physically located. You're physically, this is the part where it matters. Your brain's down here. So if that gets cut off, that's where it's lights out, and there's no more free will. So I think that'd just be like an interesting like little.
You might act differently. Yeah.
Like just an interesting little counterpoint, which is, okay, well, you're saying your free will and your consciousness comes from here, but it actually doesn't. And so, as far as arguing whether something's right or wrong, you're wrong. you're not up in here, you're down in here.
Yep.
So yeah, just a little.
Yeah. Okay. One actually
on
interesting one that I don't want to miss conversing about is you mentioned the eyes,
Mm-hmm.
and so here's an interesting one. I'm just trying to think about it, and probably best just conversing about it is. So we think I'm gonna look there. I'm looking at that thing, and I'm looking at a blue. Cool. And I'm looking at the square. I'm looking at this window and the camera. But your brain plays a little game before that you ever actually understand that. And when you look at something, when it comes through your eyes, it's in reverse. It's upside down. Right?
Yep.
So when it hits your iris actually inverts it backwards into your retinas at the back. And then your brain does a little game and flips it the way around to actually for you to understand the world as it is. So you have no free will over that. That is pure just you've been designed, how it all works. That's just being done. You're not freewheeling the fact that I'm going to now look upside down. No, that's not how it works. Like that's already coming through. Your brain's doing that work and you have no idea about it. Hell, you can't do anything about it. So that's where you can start defining, well, do you have the free will really then? Because you'll say, okay, well, yeah, I can look anywhere. But then but your brain's actually doing the one that's doing all the work behind the scenes. So really, no, you're not. And then it comes into this, that's where I don't want people who then have conversations outside of this as well, know when to draw that line so you don't just keep sort of like leapfrogging backwards and backwards and backwards and backwards to say, oh yeah, but what about this? And oh, what about that? And it's the whole conversation of someone says, oh, well, I've got free will. And someone will say, oh, but you don't have control of your chemical reactions in your brain to do that. And then you'll be, oh, well, no, because I had to think about it. And when I think about it, the chemical reaction happens. And it's like, oh, well, but you can't have that thought because you have to have a chemical reaction to think about that thing and make it. So you can go
goes
all the way around. And that at that point, it's like, well, just chicken and egg kind of conversation.
Yeah,
no, you got to draw the line at
yeah.
that point.
Yeah.
But I thought it'd be cool to mention that I think. So I know a lot of people don't think about that.
Yeah, and here's I don't know if you've heard of this. So you can actually get glasses which invert the world. So you'll see everything as if your head was turned around. And what your brain will actually do is after a couple of weeks of doing this, it'll re-invert so that when you're looking through these glasses, the world will look normal again. But then when you take the glasses off, everything's
that would be so bad.
So trippy. And then it takes, I think, another couple of weeks for your brain once you've taken the glasses off to re-invert. Can you imagine how scary that would be?
That would be so scary.
The first person doing this test, they're doing it, and then the whole world's upside down, and then there's got to be some questions going through in your brain like,
is this ever going to go back?
Yeah.
Am I wearing these glasses forever? Oh,
man,
scary
that
would
stuff.
be so scary.
So I just wanted to end for me on why not believing has actually been good for me, and in that sense, like I mentioned, why I pretty much act as if I have free will, everyone has free will, and this is my point of why I don't particularly believe it, is that it's a useful psychological tool to have in the tool case. So for me, I found it's just made me a bit more accepting, empathetic, compassionate towards people, because especially when they're doing something negative. And this is where one of those scenarios where I think you can have like a certain tool which you use on certain occasions just to make the world a better place in essence for yourself and for others. And so I wouldn't want to use this in senses where, we're talking about you paid off your HEX debt, and that wouldn't be a case where it's like, oh no, Juan didn't actually do it because he has no free will because, and then go down the whole list. No, that's one where it's preferable for me to go, man, that's awesome. Like you put in lots of hard work, you finally paid it off. You made those choices with your work and saving up and all these other things. But on the flip side, I find it useful in negative situations where, someone cuts me off in traffic or does something that I really, it feels like it affects me personally, or is just like, oh man, it's a scum human being. I find it useful in those sorts of cases to, if I can remember, a lot of times I can't, but if I can go, that guy doesn't have free will. Like, so who am I getting angry at? What's the point of getting angry at this person if they don't have that? And it's just a way for me to temper my own emotions, bring me down to a compassionate level and go, okay, well, that didn't really matter. It's almost like a way of just cutting at the knees that thing that's angering you or making you depressed or adding negative emotions to your experience. Cutting that down a little bit and it's going, oh, okay, I'll still feel it. and I'll still probably be angry a little bit afterwards, but it takes a little bit of the edge off of it. So, and the other one is compassion for yourself as well. So sort of almost, not when I do realize I'm sabotaging myself, or I said I was going to do the certain thing and then I broke it, my will broke, and then I did end up eating sugar, or I said to this person I'll be here at this time and then I didn't do it, and then I'm feeling guilty and feeling all these things. At those times as well, and it's this sometimes it is useful to feel the guilt, because that can enact change as well. But sometimes as well, it's good to be like, have a bit of compassion for myself. Oh, well, when you get down to it, most of my decisions were affected by things long ago in my past, which I had no control over. So do better next time. But, for the moment, just let it go. You couldn't control it.
Look, that's what I was going to say in terms of why my view of free will and where it actually comes into play. It's the whole, it allows you to not be so down upon yourself, but still learn from a situation and improve it on next time. So my specific example is emotions control decisions, but your reactions to actions has been built over many, many years, over many things that you might even not know about, and some that you do. Awesome. But if an event happens and you react to something, and it could be subconsciously at this point, you could react, then you reflect, and you go, dang, I acted really badly. And that's where that conversation goes, like, oh, why did I act so badly? That's where you can go, look, I didn't have any free will at that point. I just did not, there was no other way I was going to act, because that's just a learned behavior from a subconscious level that I'm going to do. But that's where you can recognize and go, okay, now at that point, that's where I say, okay, now you have some free will. Now you're in a conscious setting. If you want to talk it in that conversation of, you've moved from that amygdala to, to your actual logical brain, and you're looking at things and you can go, okay, I can do this better, or I can set these things in place, or I can try and react in these different ways. And then you implement it so that next time when that no free will comes in and kicks in subconscious, there's that layer of the consciousness kind of watching for it, and then a little bit of free will can kick in. And that's why that's where I see it as, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in your subconscious that you have no will over, but as soon as it turns into that realm of the self or the conscious, you can try to intercept it and engage with it and bring it into some sort of will. So people get really, really uncomfortable with the fact that the origins of free will comes from no free will, but I think I'm comfortable in saying that everything originates from no free will, and then you can intercept it at the conscious to create some free will.
Nice, man.
And that's how I say that's the feeling of when you act and you feel like you're doing something. It's you intercepting the unconscious.
Yeah, nice, man. This has been a good convo. I enjoyed this. A takeaway just from both of those was, whether you believe in it or not, I'd say find the method, the way of thinking about it that works best for you and does the most good for the world. And, however psychologically you make that happen, that's probably the best way of going about it. So,
Agree.
And
free will.
And don't get too caught up on ad absurdums and going too deep into it, because it's fun every now and then, but if we had this conversation every day, I'd be bored as hell.
You would, yeah. And you'd kind of just be touching over the same things and then just getting deeper into different realms.
Exactly,
and there's a point where you got to call it and go, enough value extracted, enough discussions.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, how much does it apply to your real day-to-day?
Yeah.
Somewhat, we just talked about them. But in other ways, no, you can't be spending all your time thinking about that.
Yeah, and that's why you need to do free will sometimes, and that's why you need to do aliens.
Exactly, aliens, that's right. That's been episode 112, Free Will. Now, folks, if you are consciously listening to this...
I've got some advice here.
Yeah, you got advice?
You don't have free will. None of you have free will. So what are you going to do? You're going to subscribe. You're going to listen to every single video. You're going to leave us a review on iTunes, and you're going to tell 10 of your friends.
Yeah, well, what you're going to do, specifically on that one is you're going to go to all your friends, right? And you're going to tell them, there is no free will, so I've got to tell you guys this. And you've got to then go tell them that they've got to tell 10 of their friends because they have no free will. No one's got free will. So